thanks everybody for joining us in the next in our series of Tea Talks. My name is David Tochterman. I'm a consultant for Biff and a television producer and film producer myself. I'm actually working on a slate of films right now. Janet Brown is with us today, who we've known together for a long time, but actually haven't quite seen each other in quite a while. But she's had quite a career on the forefront of distribution, both traditional and as the industry has turned to digital. Janet, I thought, give you a chance to talk a little bit about you and your road and your trajectory and Gunpowder and how FilmBuff led to Gunpowder, and then we'll talk a little bit about what's happening in our industry with respect to distribution. Sound good?
Sure. And I think I see, in the attendees, Max. Hi, Max. Shout out.
Hi, Max.
Yeah, so I used to, I ran a company called FilmBuff back in the days when films were distributed to multiple places. I think we can talk here as much as folks want about how that has changed. But certainly one of the reasons I sold it is that I saw the writing on the wall with respect to films not getting distributed to multiple places. So, which means that a lot of stuff is obviously going straight to streamer, which I think is exciting in terms of getting films in front of an audience, and being able to have a global audience see it. But it does mean that, as we all know, as consumers of Netflix or Amazon or anything else, that it's very easy to get your film lost. Not everything is on. I mean, arguably HBO and HBO Max do the best job of curation. So everybody is kind of aware of the new stuff coming to those platforms. But the same could not be said for Netflix or even Hulu. But I think Netflix is probably the worst. Just stuff comes and goes and you never would know. So what does that mean as a storyteller? What does that mean in front of getting an audience? What does that mean in the terms of like the kind of stories that you want to tell? And even with the news saying how voracious the appetites are, and yesterday Disney saying how much money they're doing for their content spend, it still is very difficult if you're a independent producer to necessarily get the story out, because it's almost like back to the studio days of 20 years ago. You kind of have like the main streamers, and then after that, it is really, if those sort of studios say no, it's a little bit tricky. So it's kind of like 2 steps forward, 1 step back, kind of, in terms of like how independent producers and directors can get stories out. If you get a yes, it's a bigger yes. But I think there are some parallels to how it was before, because even, when the studios would release it, they would bury stuff that was released theatrically, and you might not be aware. So I guess there's pros and cons, but certainly in terms of what we've been up to, we were doing a lot of distribution for independent films. At FilmBuff, we released, over 1,000 titles. And now over time at Gunpowder, we've kind of moved away from third-party distribution and much more focused on making our own content, co-financing and co-producing with others, and then distributing that content that we ourselves either own or control the IP, and can participate in it fully. So, and that's true across the board. A lot of folks like us, look at A24 has done a similar trajectory. A lot of smaller distributors have just no longer exist. But in general, people either no longer exist or are working back up the chain to positions where they are financing or taking more active ownership in the IP, which is a trend that started, let's say, 5 years ago, but I think has really accelerated, well, certainly with COVID, but just before COVID.
Great. Well, so actually, you've covered you mentioned in your overview a lot of the things that I think we should talk about, because it certainly has an effect on film community and filmmakers. I mean, this week, half of the Oscar-nominated films are released on streamers. Even the biggest studios in the world in theatrical, like Pixar, are now releasing online. And this could actually be the first year that a streaming platform wins Best Picture, right? So
yeah,
where are we? How does the theatrical window and the streaming platform coexist?
Yeah, I think it is really just, I think COVID has done good things in terms of like banging down some of those vestiges of, all these tricks around having theatrical releases and stuff. But honestly, at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter how it's released. It matters what people think about the content. And it's almost like more from a filmmaking perspective, it's almost been more interesting, not the shift from theatrical to streaming, but the shift from movies to series. And those two shifts have obviously happened very much in parallel, because series were never going to share the same glory when films were on the big screen and they were on the TV. But now all those kind of stereotypes and stuff are removed, and the small screen favors series for all the reasons that we know, again, as consumers, we're binging and watching and everything else. And it's like, I mean, the last time, I am sure for everyone here, you more recently watched a series than a movie, I would venture to say. I know it's true for myself, but I think it's true for most of us. So I think that trend is really interesting if one is a filmmaker, because what does it mean for films these days? That I think is an interesting.
There are filmmakers that, talent at some point would, some talent would rather be on a streamer without the pressure of a theatrical release and the box office, because they would much rather be judged on the creative success of the film, not on the box office performance, right?
Yeah.
So this is the way I think it trickles down to the filmmakers as well. Even though, here's my question for you: how do you balance that against the fact that how do filmmakers even track performance of their projects? With streamers releasing so many titles, no viewership numbers. How do you sort of, how do those two things go together in your mind?
Well, obviously, it's somewhat better than it was, because in terms of the deal structures, you know exactly how much money you're going to make, and no one can, tell you to accept a low payment up front because you're going to get back in later, which used to be right. All of those deals. So that no longer is a conversation. So that from a seller's perspective is good, because you can guarantee your margin up front. But from a reporting perspective, obviously they do share anecdotal information, and the bigger and larger a supplier you are, the more information gets shared with you. I don't know for a fact, but it is my understanding that others who are larger than us do get very detailed feedback on how their stuff is doing. We get anecdotal feedback. And obviously, if they come back to you and quickly respond to your next pitch, your first one must not have totally sucked. So, I think, yeah, but you're right. The metrics are a little bit different, certainly in terms of the SVOD platforms like Netflix. Ones that have more of an ad incorporated thing do have other ways of doing the metrics, right? Like Peacock or Hulu.
So I wanted to segue to something you and I talked about on the phone, which is the biggest shift being having shifted from finding the audience as opposed to waiting for the audience to find you, which means that you're incorporating a lot of data and whether anecdotal or detailed feedback you can get on the data. I think that's something that should be demystified for filmmakers. How does that work? Because that's something we talked about on the phone. I would like you to talk a little bit about that.
Well, I think certainly back in the FilmBuff days and like independent distribution days, the onus for marketing was very much on the filmmaker together with the distributor. And some of our best releases were based on like a really high degree of teamwork between us and the producer and the director, really marketing together, and the director really knowing their base and their audience, and us really enabling them to double down on what they already knew. And it was a real partnership, and we just worked very hard to to carry that burden of marketing. Now, the buyers, the studios have all the data. So Amazon and Netflix, they have all the data. They know, where they have white spaces in terms of the content on the platform. They know what is over indexing on the platform. And so the use of data gets reflected to us now in terms of what kind of content they're buying. So, and what kind of content they say they're interested in. So it really now is like we're pitching content to them already based on what we think is important for them. Like, what is Amazon saying they want? What is Disney saying they want? What's Netflix saying they want? And they're saying what they want based on the data. So it does mean that the onus for marketing is no longer on us at all. It's like 100% on the streamer. But we have to be very smart about knowing what's important for the streamer so that we have successful pitches when we bring content in. So the role is still the same insofar as we are connecting like the original creator and the audience, but it is very much changed from like where we are connecting the original creator and then bringing a film out across all different platforms to now where we are connecting the creator with the best platform that's most likely to support and take on their project, usually as an original. So it never is going to go anywhere else anyway.
Are you able to apply that to films that are not sold directly to a first window on a streamer? Like if you were to sell.
Well, I mean, we just finished Sundance, and obviously there's situations that still happen where films are independently financed, brought to a festival, and like are bought by folks who aren't streamers. You know, Focus is still buying, or Universal, but those are very few and far between. I mean, we're doing a lot in the doc space, and one of the biggest doc sales was Fire of Love, which, you know, was sold by a traditional sales agent in terms of Submarine, but, you know, mid seven figures, 7 million, you know, where it went for it to Nat Geo for that is a pretty great number. And that's a situation where, again, there was no one that was going to take that there was only a streamer that's going to spend that number and do that deal. There's no way that you're going to have a sort of all rights distributor doing that. It doesn't make sense for anybody. And presumably more people are going to see it on Nat Geo than would have seen it, you know, in theaters.
Well, so one thing that gets talked about frequently at BIFF is the concept of how filmmakers can or should self-distribute. And in a world where data plays such a big part, how do you see that working out for filmmakers in terms of filmmakers want to self-distribute their films, even on a limited basis? How has, you know, this move towards data changed that? And what advice would you give them?
Well, I mean, I guess it depends how you describe the self-distribution, because like, if that means you've kind of tried to get a streamer interested in and they've passed and you still want to get it seen, then your options are trying to work with, you know, local communities to do theatrical releases, which Berkshire's is probably a great place to do that. But then the question is, how do you get it out to a broader audience? So at some point still, you need someone to help you get it onto digital platforms to get it seen. And like Amazon last year famously canceled the ability of an individual filmmaker to upload a doc. And I'm sure everybody saw that, and there was like a general furor about it. And now they're sort of like slowly creeping back. And, you know, we had a legacy deal that allowed us to do it, and as did some other distributors, but they just like put their foot down. And before, anybody as an independent filmmaker could have said, oh, you know what, I'm going to put the film in my local theater, and then I'm going to go upload it to PVD and I'm done. I've self-distributed. But that is kind of difficult now, because with PVD doing that, they were like the major door for that. Mm-hmm. So self-distribution now, you still need to use some kind of third party to have digital distribution, unless you're literally going to put it on YouTube. You can't access like iTunes or any of the TVOD platforms. You can't just upload to Roku or to Tubi or any of these places. They're very selective. So there still is this like middleman function that is needed to get the content more widely distributed.
Does that, I would assume that means there's an increase in pitches that you get, right? Do you take?
Yes, and we no longer
or not anymore.
We don't do that anymore. Right. So yeah, we stopped doing it for third-party content, as did many others, because the sort of the bifurcation of the market has become, you know, it just doesn't make sense unless you're doing it on a huge basis, like as an aggregator, you know, as like FilmRise or Cinedigm or one of these companies that is massively aggregating content, you know, in the tens of thousands, where it doesn't matter how a single film does. But I think it's a little bit of an it kind of puts more onus back on you as a creator. So whether, what is the story you're trying to tell? And if it's a story that the streamers don't want, who are you making that story for?
Right.
Sorry, I just saw a question come up.
Somebody
How do you
just
find the middle?
asked a very good question.
How do you find the middleman? Well, I know I was setting myself up for that question. So in this case, like some companies are still doing that. So like FilmRise and Cinedigm are still doing that business. Giant is still in that business. There's some of the independent distributors are still doing it. Like Sam Goldwyn is still doing stuff. Roadside, Vertical, Saban. So there's still a bunch of like indie distributors. It just is not, what it was, let's say 6 years ago, when there was like voracious appetite. When I was running FilmBuff, there was just a whole stuff. IFC was constantly buying, Magnolia was constantly buying. It was just like, a very dynamic. Now it's a little bit fewer and far between, but they're still there. So those distributors the independent distributors are still a middleman that can help you distribute your documentary. All those companies I just named are very possible companies, and either one can approach them themselves, or you can use a sales agent to represent your film to get a distributor to pick it up.
Which, let's segue from that to the fact that not many, but there are a handful of distributors that are now acting as financiers themselves. And that's certainly the situation I'm in right now with Mar Vista, right? My slate deal with Mar Vista, they're actually co-financing the films in order to get first rights for distribution. So they're literally equity partners in these films. Do you see that as a trend that will grow? I mean, internationally, certainly, right? I mean, distributors are financing films.
Yep. Yeah, definitely. And, in our space as well, we might be distributing a film and then we are representing it to the market as sort of sales / distribution. Like we have one coming out on Discovery Plus next month by Werner and Rudolf Herzog. And that's one where we, financed it, and then also in return are representing the world. And we ended up selling it to Discovery. But if we hadn't sold it to Discovery for the world, we would have distributed all around the world, done territory sales and just distributed it as like a normal documentary.
Right. And does the math still work for you to be able to break even internationally and then have the domestic window be where you see profit? Does that model still work?
That hasn't been a model that we've necessarily used, because unlike someone like Mar Vista, we're not sort of like a meat and potatoes foreign sales company. We are more of a production company with sales and marketing capabilities. So we see ourselves, we are more producing for streamers. Like on the doc side, we have a first look with HBO and HBO Max for both doc features and doc series. So we are definitely more of a production company with capabilities than a Mar Vista, which would be like an international sales agent getting more aggressive in terms of their financial risk.
Right. So what's a preferred first window for you? Streamer, obviously, right?
Well, usually, I mean, it's definitely, if the streamer is going to give you a deal that makes sense, then that's it. But the deal always has to make sense. So, and if it doesn't make sense, certainly for us, we always want to have a backup option in terms of how we handle the film. Like on the Herzog one, like we didn't know Discovery was going to come in. It's great that they came in, but we were fully prepared to do all the work to distribute it ourselves if they did not. So that's the advantage we have versus, a standalone production company where you basically can't do anything unless a streamer buys it. We are definitely, if the streamer buys it, great, but if they don't, we're ready to go regardless.
I actually wanted to come back to something we talked about earlier, which is that people tend to, for the most part, you assume that if you're selling it to a streamer, they're buying out your entire back end, right? For a cost plus model where you can make more upfront in exchange for buying out the streamer, buying out your back end. I'm starting to see more examples of that windowing beginning to change. And I was wondering what you feel is happening and where that could be trending, where you can sort of define getting the rights back after a certain period of time, and other types of ways to sort of skin that cat.
It depends. So it depends on what the project is who's involved in the project and how, what the negotiation is. Because if it is an original, where it's being commissioned by the platform, then it's a commission. So you're not going to get any rights back, and it's a complete buyout like any normal commission would be. If you are making the film yourself, like you're independently financing it and then you're selling it, then it's not a commission. So then you're licensing it. And if you're licensing it, then it's more of a discussion around where the rights go and what the term is and all of that. So it really depends ultimately, like many things, who paid for it. So that's kind of driving those things. I'm seeing another question in
Yeah,
here.
we have another question.
Wait, Tree Films Festival, or you go forward. That really depends. So certainly one of the other things that has changed with all of these other things, as I'm sure you've all seen, like just even looking at Sundance, is the role of the festival is very different, and the films that are in the festival is very different. So the same way there's now like streamer content being seriously in the Oscar conversation, the streamers already had were already involved in a lot of the films that were in Sundance. And the same is going to be true at South by and every other festival. So there's fewer films at the festivals that aren't spoken for, which means that those films have already been sold before the festival. But then the role of the festival is changing from, say, 10 years ago, when the festival was where tons of films that had all distribution rights available were like thrown up to the world, and then distributors could choose which one they want. That's not the case. Now it's like really more of a marketing showcase for a lot of the streamers, for them to show their films. Like if you look at tons of the films that were at Sundance are now being released right after Sundance. So Sundance was like their marketing start, their PR start. It was almost like the theatrical release, and then it goes on to the streamer. And the same thing's going to be true at South by, and the same thing is true at Toronto and all these other festivals. It's basically like the theatrical run for the streamer content is the festival. So to answer the question in the chat, is it better to wait? It really depends. Like it was obviously highly intentional on the part of the folks involved in Fire of Love to not sell that to a streamer before the festival. They could have easily sold that. I don't know personally the actual details, so if anyone on the call knows, but in my opinion, they could have easily sold that film to Nat Geo before Sundance or Discovery, and they could have had a bidding war between either of those two buyers and whoever else was interested, but outside the festival environment. I think what the festival environment probably did is raise the price. So that was a good decision. But in terms of the films that the festivals are accepting, they're all, like if you look at South by or you look at Sundance, there's super commercial stuff in the lineup that is already represented by streamers, or it's like really small, kind of like almost non-commercial content, a lot of it that's there, that's getting into the festival. So they kind of are having this like more binary approach of like super popular stuff that's already spoken for by the streamers, and then super like issue driven, social action driven, less commercial stuff that's kind of rounding out the slate. So whether it's better to wait for the festival very much depends on the film, and it depends on your options for financing it. If you need to get the film made with financing, you still have the same two options you've always had, doing it independently or doing it with a studio. But most people are choosing to make it with a studio if they can. And once you've made it with the studio, then the question of the festival is out of your hands. Like on this Herzog one with Discovery, we did submit it to the festivals. It was a super early cut. It didn't get into any of the festivals because it was a rough cut and not that great. And now that it's done and awesome, there isn't a festival kind of in the right sort of time frame, so we're just releasing it. So it just, it depends when the content's ready, when is it ready to go. Like we have another one with Showtime, a documentary on Sheryl Crow, and that's going to be at South by, and the timing's perfect, and Showtime will be releasing afterwards. But in that case, we all submit to the festivals, and then we kind of jointly decide with the streamer what's happening on it.
And do you have an equal voice at the table? And that's
Yeah, I mean, we like in the case of Sheryl Crow, it's our production, it's our original. We sold it to Showtime. So once again, it wasn't an original, it was a sale. Same with Herzog. So, you know, it's definitely a conversation around like, you know, what like, you know, like with Discovery, it was like, okay, should we wait for more festivals now that the film is done and submit? And it was like, yeah, no, like we're ready to go. No point waiting for more. Like we're just going to release. So it's definitely a discussion each time. Yeah.
One thing I wanted to touch on, because I know we don't have a lot of time, was, um, you know, one thing that Gunpowder has done really well is create these niche audiences around what are commonly known as fast channels, or you know, and obviously the word fast channel can mean different things in different contexts. But you have made, you know, Gunpowder has several of these niche channels that are putting out original content and films, some short, some full length, I think. And I think this audience would be really interested in learning how that actually works, to have that kind of a niche audience and channel.
Yeah. Yeah. That's good, because I feel like otherwise this conversation is kind of depressing, because it's like, what the heck, if I have something and it doesn't go to Netflix, then what? So there is hope. And yes, Herzog did have to deal with festival rejection after a rough cut. We all have to deal with it, even Herzog. But you know, we're fine, we're good. And the film is great. Highly recommend everyone watch it in March. But moving on to your question, David. So yeah, so from a like new filmmaker perspective, I think everything we've been talking about the past, you know, 20 minutes is kind of sort of a titch depressing, because you're like, where is a new filmmaker? Am I going to really march into Netflix or, you know, whatever? So one thing that we've been really heavily focused on, and by the way, we work with new filmmakers all the time. So I know I mentioned Herzog, but we have another 2-part doc series coming out in a couple weeks on HBO Max, which is with a first-time filmmaker, young guy. So, and he came to us, we loved it, we sold it. So it's absolutely possible as a first-time filmmaker to sell into streamer. You just need to partner with someone who's a experienced producer. So you'd partner with someone like us, or, you know, another production company, and then go. But anyway, so in terms of other opportunities for filmmakers, so we have 2 brands. So Gunpowder is a production company. We're focused on docs and doc series. We're focused on unscripted, and we're focused on YA kind of MTV type content, because the company was started by Van Toffler, who ran MTV for ages. And we have a huge audio thing. So as a studio, our production side is very much focused on those kind of lanes. We separately have a D2C brand business. We have 2 brands, one in the sci-fi space called Dust, and one in the horror space called Alter. Those are the lifeblood of those brands is short films made by first-time, second-time directors. And we take our role as like a voice for new filmmakers super seriously. And so we pride ourselves on the curation for both of those brands. If you look on either of the social channels, YouTube is where those films are released. We have launched a Dust linear channel, which has those films packaged into kind of Black Mirror type episodes. And we also license in other cool content. And so we've made it a sci-fi fan channel. And we are about to launch the same thing in March for Alter. So it'll be a linear channel for Alter, which will have the Alter shorts inside it with a bunch of other awesome content for horror fans. Yeah, so if no one knows what I'm talking about or what David's talking about, basically TV channels from like 1990 style have been recreated, but instead of those channels being broadcast with satellite dishes and like coming over the air, the channels are now being streamed out by the cloud. So if you have like a Roku or a Samsung or IMDb or Redbox or any of these apps, they all have a section of VOD assets, which looks a lot like Netflix. And then they also have a section of live streaming linear channels, which looks a lot like old school TV. It's like an EPG with channels in it, and it's all sponsored by advertising, and it is literally like TV circa 1996, but played out by the cloud. And the important thing for content providers is the advertising is much better because it's all targetable, because it's digital as opposed to over the air. So this is kind of like the new promise of TV. And if you use Roku specifically, on their EPG, they've integrated it. So if you look on their Roku EPG, you can't tell which of the channels are kind of like old school broadcast channels like NBC, and which are new digital channels like Dust. They just perfectly integrate them on the EPG, which is great. And we've seen a lot of success with Dust. We've, have hit a massive fan base in terms of sci-fi content, and we're excited for horror. But what it means for filmmakers is if we've accepted your short and we program your short, there's all these other places that it lives. Like it ends up going on our TV channel. It ends up, we may do something with it on the podcast side. We have it on our social. It like has a whole life. And then what we do with the shorts is obviously we're looking to set them up. And we've already had some success stories where films that have come into us as a short, we've then gone on to set them up as a feature or a series, which is kind of like a IP sort of pipeline. And that's super exciting for us to help nurture those voices and get them seen, which means, ironically, from a short perspective,
if you're a filmmaker that sells or licenses a short film they've made to one of your channels, how long do you typically take that film off the market for the right to see if it's possible to develop it into a bigger opportunity?
Oh, we don't soak up the derivative rights for very long because we realize it's high value. So we have a discussion and we'll make sure that it's like it's flexible so that we have a window to do it. And then otherwise the filmmaker is free to go. 6
months or something like that, 3 months?
Yeah, it depends, but it's not like you're tied up for years on end. Yeah, exactly. How worthwhile is it to privately undertake a target to generate response numbers for a potential buyer? I would say it is not very worthwhile. As part of the pitch on any piece of content, particularly if it's a doc, usually pitches do involve numbers like if you're selling a doc about a musical artist, you're going to have like, what their Spotify views are, what their social profile is, all that kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, it at least in my experience, is not really a deciding factor in whether the platform does it. Because they have other things like what demographic does that audience target? Is that a demographic that they're interested in having on the platform? So it might be the biggest band ever, but if that band skews older, they might not be interested just because the platform's trying to target a younger audience. So I think having some numbers about like, whether it's a doc and you have like very clear numbers on the person or a subject, or it's a narrative and you have really clear numbers on, I don't know, comps or something. It's always helpful, but it is not, it's not like in and alone going to be the deciding thing. And I certainly wouldn't spend money on doing private tests. I would just gather publicly available information and have it as part of a pitch.
Well, I want to sort of, since we are getting questions, I think we should move into the Q&A and see if anybody else has any questions for Janet about any of what we're talking about here, which is kind of cool for filmmakers as well as for studios, independent studios. Anybody have any other questions for Janet?
The one thing I'll say, well, people figure out if they have a question, just to follow up on the other thing is like, I do think, while I was saying 10 years ago that arguably the indie distribution landscape was more robust, in terms of having options. At the same time, as like a short filmmaker, it was always one of those things where people were super frustrated. Like there was never anything to do with shorts and you submitted to a festival and it was just like, like a calling card that everyone did for school. And it was like not so helpful. I do think that the positive side of everything that's going on is shorts are like really they have viable options. Like if you come with us, like we're actively using them. And the other thing is they are really active calling cards. The streamers are so hungry and so voracious for content that they're absolutely not opposed to first-time directors, as I was saying. And if you have a short that kind of proves that you can tell your story, like a lot of people, like what we're doing with Dustin Alter, we have a short and then we're pitching a long form version of the short. So of course, the first-time director, may come along for the ride on that, or they may not. It may get packaged with a different.
Assuming that there's already a full-length script that's been.
Well, the script will have to get written, or maybe the filmmaker has the script, or maybe we're paying for a writer to do it. It depends, And maybe the director of the short stays on to direct the next thing, or maybe they don't. They stay on as a producer. It just all depends. But certainly, from the streamer perspective, they're very open to first-time talent, and shorts are really helping people get comfortable with people's capabilities and also with like a sample version of the story. And so I'm excited about that. The person asking, I'm happy for David to share my email. I'm just seeing someone asking if they can ask me more questions. So you're welcome to email me if you have more questions. But yeah, but I do think it's like forums like this that really help. And despite the increased consolidation of buyers in the form of the streamers, there's more opportunities than ever for new voices to get to the streamers. So there's a plus and the minus, but I think on the whole it's a plus. You know, if I was a filmmaker 10 years ago and all the studios said no, you were kind of like shit out of luck. And the studio might have taken it for the US and your film would have never gotten distributed internationally. Now, like the streamers are all basically global. So if you get a yes, your chance of getting stuff in front of a global audience is just so cool in a way that was just not possible before. So on the whole, I think it's really exciting what's happened and how fast the feedback loop is between filmmakers and audiences. Like you can go yourself on Netflix and you can see what's working for them because it's right there on the top 10 list. You know, it doesn't require a massive amount of research. So we can all take it upon ourselves to be like, this is what's working on Netflix. Let me see if I want to give them more of that. And the circle is so short. Like we don't have to wait around for studios to buy billboards on highways. We can just put it out on streamers. And that means that the content's so much more timely and relevant. Like we're having so much content now that's about issues actually going on in the world right now. And there's so much more opportunity for docs. Well, like 10 years ago, docs were not talked about in the way they are now. And right. Docs are becoming like such a huge thing and like such a great way for us to understand issues in our world.
Docs are a big part of Biff's programming as well. And Kelly can speak to that.
So that's a, you know, a super exciting part. I don't think docs have ever had more of a heyday than they're having now. I mean, the filmmakers we used to work with, as Max knows, like, I mean, those documentary filmmakers are slaving away for years with like, take Chris Smith. He was slaving away as a client of my old boss, John Sloss at Cinetic. That guy was slaving away on movies for centuries. And no one ever heard of him before Tiger King or any of these other ones. You look at who the filmmakers are, and these aren't just like fly-by-night folks. These are like doc filmmakers who've been working and slaving away for centuries, and now they finally are being get their due, which is great. And they've like led the path for newer, younger filmmakers to come in. So we're you know, really excited about all of those changes, and very it's exciting for all of us as part of the industry, I think.
Well, independent film is alive and well. I mean, I think that's, you know, that's what's exciting, is that despite all the hurdles, you know, and Sundance has changed so much, and thanks for spending some time on that. But, you know, independent film is really alive and well, which is great.
Yep.
And always will be, I think. You know, the more the bigger platforms are, you know, sort of push towards big media, I think the role of independent film is more vital than ever.
Yeah. Yeah, I do think so. And I'm happy. And there's other companies like us that act as kind of, you know, feeders really for the streamers. And so as a first time filmmaker, I advise you to, you know, choose a company like us, depending on what your content is. There's not just us, there's a bunch of us, and partner with someone who is an established production company and use them to go in and find a home for your project. But we're all hungry. We all have different relationships. Our relationship happens to be HBO. Other people have first looks with Netflix, and you know, everyone has their own thing. So there's lots of doors to knock on. Like while there might be 7 or 8 ultimate streamer buyers, there's a lot of different people on the next layer down of the pyramid that are good partners for folks as independent directors and producers.
Cool. Anybody have any more
Very
questions?
true.
That's every question on the film industry today.
Okay, well, I think, Janet, I want to thank you for doing this and spending so much time telling our audience about all this. It's great stuff.
Thank you for the invitation, and thanks everyone for taking time out of your morning. Go Berkshires, go.